Chapter Octo. Extraction. Among the party guests, the mood tilted without direct influence of the rebels. The crossfire secured the building and herded them into the party hall. "It is for your protection," they were told, but the envoys distrusted the Laxarians. As proud representatives of their country, they were reluctant to be treated like livestock. "This is outrageous, and an insult to my status. I will inform the Khan about this," Jin Fa Shuo shrilly announced. He and Tamrat of Al-Kebu might have agreed on little, neither in ideology nor in their faith. In this respect, they shared an opinion.
"As far as we are concerned, that deal is off."
She spoke for herself as well as her grandmother.
"Laxaria cannot fulfill its share. I would hereby like to withdraw."
The envoys from Shenhuan and Al-Kebu considered the event over, which met with little approval among the soldiers. Just as they stood up, one dared to raise arms against them. "An insolence!" Jin Fa Shuo spoke indignantly. "Get that gun out of my face, boy, or I will exterminate your entire bloodline." A threat that he occasionally translated into action.
"Calm down, all of you,"
shouted Mutlal Alumti, envoy from the gardens of Lisbia, remaining the only one to be diplomatic.
"I am sure our hosts have only our welfare in mind."
He said it to the soldiers rather than to them.
"What do you intend to do? Who among you is in command?"
"I. And I commanded anyone not wearing a uniform with the banner of ISPAT. Sit down immediately," said irritably the one whose rifle barrel he was looking into. The forceful way he handled the situation did little to ease the tension among the guests. He could not be a particularly senior man. Stealthily, the leadership team made their escape amidst the explosions. The uneasy feeling was reinforced among those present that they were being herded together like cattle for slaughter. "Sit down, I said. I will not repeat myself again," the soldier barked, waving his barrel toward the chair. Their superior numbers lulled him into a false sense of security, the feeling of having pen pushers in front of him, not soldiers. And what could their protectors do against 20 warriors of ISPAT? Ear's bodyguard might have been a monster. He thought they could handle it. And the concubines from Shenhuan. Through them, the term bodyguards acquired a significance that brought him into conflict with his faith. It kept him from taking them seriously. The misjudgment was to cost him his head. It was thought that they were disarmed at the entrance. Somehow they managed to sneak in a short sword under each kimono. One pulled it out from underneath and decapitated him with the same motion. Immediately, they fell upon the soldiers, at an inhuman pace. Whoever was just out of reach of the blade found it in his flesh after a spurt. They claimed limbs with surgical precision, sliding through muscle and guts, organs, bone and cartilage. On the path of the cutting edge, everything became butter. The Laxarian superior number was reduced by 5 before one reacted, and anarchy broke out to create new hierarchies. The one who held his rifle on ear was torn in two with bare hands. Ghoul stood protectively in front of his mistress, facing more of ISPAT's fighters. They let off volleys at him. The bullets penetrated his flesh, but he seemed immune to lead.
"He is a monster!"
screeched a Laxarian, immediately silent forever. A giant paw settled on the face, crushing it like a ripe tomato. None of them received mercy, except those who dropped their weapons. They were allowed to die faster. Even if they begged him, the monster, ISPAT, and their god, the trinity of their despair, he sent them on their way. His sheer presence, size, and brutality with which he proceeded distracted from the concubines, which suited them. They plowed through the enemy ranks with lightning speed, taking cover at the right moment, as soon as they were fired upon, and were resourceful in their feints. Often their own people ended up as human shields, so that as many died at the hands of their brothers in arms as their blade. The blood price was paid. The girls whirled around, writhing with graceful maneuvers, practically dodging bullets, until the last stalwart warrior of ISPAT who did not even notice how his comrades were fading around him, was generously scalped with a clean blow. Beside Zia, a soldier crawled away. She took off her crocodile's muzzle, and it immediately set upon the feast.
Fine.
She commented cheerfully.
That settles that. See you later.
This didn't just mean the living. Also, the dead as well as those who were not yet, but wished to be. She walked away as if the slaughter were none of her business, only the after. In the base of the Collegat, they circulated through the corridors in a bright commotion. KLEIO and the rest had gotten into the backyard unnoticed. The troops concentrated on the neighborhood. A small unit secured the courtyard. KLEIO's group gathered by the medicinal plants at an elder bush and observed the area.
The soldiers are a surmountable obstacle.
Shima whispered, referring to at least a dozen and pointing opposite.
That's what worries me.
An Armabellum 415 stood there. KLEIO and the Taurdians could understand her concerns.
We must try to capture it.
Brina spoke like a pirate with a telescope on the thickest warship in the fleet.
I'm sure they'll jump right in as soon as they perceive a threat.
Emery surmised. They stood too close to the beast.
What if they don't perceive a threat from us?
How are you going to set
Asked
that up?
KLEIO.
They seem pretty alarmed.
Were you thinking of running to them naked?
Asked Shima teasingly.
I'd be in. But how am I supposed to hide my gun? And no, I wouldn't go that far. If we show ourselves naked to them, a few would die right away. From excitement, of course.
She felt she had to emphasize the latter.
We don't have time for lesbian mischief.
Brina replied. Shima repaid her with a blown kiss.
Do you have a better idea? I was expecting something like this.
She justified herself. From the sound of it, there was hope of not running into any.
If they activate it, the game is over. We have to be damn careful.
Shima's suggestion wasn't even far off from what Brina had in mind, only it wouldn't be done in the nude. Instead, she would get to show off her acting skills. This performance decided whether her career would come to an early end. The lesbian slipped into her role mentally, before revealing herself alone and worthy of an Oscar.
Help! Help me! Thank you, Icebat. I'm safe.
She sobbed, doubled over into a nervous wreck, the poor thing she was portraying. Posture and vocal pitch, her get-up became a costume. Rivulets of tears erupted at the drop of a hat, convincing enough that she was perceived as no threat. Just some reached for their weapons, but the highest-ranking one was in charge, and he seemed more taken with it than alarmed.
Complete chaos broke out at His Eminence's feast. I barely escaped with my life. My beloved tried to protect me, and died in the crossfire.
She continued despondently, which awakened the protector in him. She knew when someone bought into her act, directed the words formally to him, as he also wore most of the medals and decorations on his uniform.
Weapons down, men.
He ordered and shared,
The lady is safe with us.
unaware that his men needed protection from her. While singing the lament, she scanned the perimeter, made out their posts, and estimated when the dramatic turn would come. Like onlookers, the men gathered around her for the restaging of the damsel in distress. Not far away, the rest of the cast lay in wait.
I like her.
KLEIO said admiringly.
She's crazy enough.
Brina shared her view. Once she had the ring of testosterone gathered around her as she saw fit, also giving her protection from the two snipers on the roof. The interlude began with the dance of death. Her gun flashed. The magazine was empty, before one drew his. She traded the pistol for a Laxarian rifle while taking cover behind the officer. For every shot, the officer's body took in. One of hers came back and found them with devastating marksmanship. Icebat would scoff at them because it was happening so fast. The officer died in her arms. One last look paid respect that he had refused a woman up to this point. With that, life left him. An exchange of fire was one of the clearer signs one could give. In her case, one could think that war was breaking out in the backyard. Brina and Emery strode out of the bushes and into the fray. KLEIO followed last, needing a bit to gather her courage. She didn't know how to defend herself against trained soldiers, fervently hoping that her companions would take care of it for her. The decisive contribution was made by Shima. Already 12 were on her account. She took cover behind a wall and engaged in an exchange of fire with the snipers on top of the building. The first just missed her and disappeared from sight with a shot to the head. The second aimed a tad too long, in the middle of which her bullet stopped him. This was by no means the end of the matter. Out of the bunker rushed a whole squadron.
They're above my pay grade,
Shima remarked with a mock gallows humor. Her tongue was the only one still sitting loose. She fully embraced her new role as a killing machine, keeping herself out of the line of fire. Whenever she came out of her cover, she always fired a bullet, and each one took out a Laxarian. Each time, before returning to cover, she would pick the next target. Emery made it all the way to her. Brina and KLEIO took up positions behind the armabellum. The Tauridians also brought down a few, but the constant shelling ensured that they were mostly kept under cover, while Shima performed a tribal dance for the Grim Reaper. She reaped souls in his name.
We need more firepower,
Brina shouted. Where they stood, they were about to be overrun, and they gradually ran out of bullets. The behemoth provided a fairly useful shield, but would have been even more effective on the offensive. The debate led nowhere. No one knew enough about the weapon system. KLEIO felt useless.
I am completely useless.
She realized, logically in the situation, and came up with a crackpot idea.
Maybe I have to become unrealistic.
She looked around as far as her cover would allow. The officer's body was lying particularly awkward there, staring at her sufferingly, a blank gaze where before his mind had been pulling the strings. Suddenly, she heard a voice in her mind, her voice, and it whispered to her.
Go to him. The echo of his soul is still fresh. The souls that leave their body by force are the purest. Quick, before someone beats you to it.
KLEIO shuddered because of her own voice, the certainty with which she said it, without a clue what it meant. What became maddening was that she thought it was the better option, better than idly loitering around. Quite a stupid expression came over the others when KLEIO put her daring into action, came out of hiding and headed straight for the corpse. Both Shima and Brina thought that there was certainly nothing of use to be found there, and exclaimed in unison. Some guardian angel had to be standing by her, immune to Laxarian frequencies, since she narrowly escaped enemy bullets several times, almost as if they were winding their way past her. Unlike Shima, who had learned to automatically dodge out of the line of fire after years of training, she must have had some kind of divine protection at work. With presence of mind, Shima backed her up, shot down two, then a third, before they pulled the trigger. That already made two supernatural creatures who gave her a hand. Her hit rate bordered on witchcraft. At times, it seemed as if she fired before the soldiers came out, as if she knew when it was going to happen. She memorized the intervals at which they would appear. Several calculations were running in her mind at the same time. Or was it something beyond that wanted them to succeed in this suicide mission? Again, KLEIO developed an ability as if from a supernatural intuition. After she touched the officer, she suddenly remembered how the machine worked, as if his memory was imprinted on her. For Brina, she lost her mind at the wrong moment, stood in the open field to get up close and personal with a corpse. She was about to run to her, when, next to her, a bullet ricocheted off the steel front of the armabellum.
Take cover, KLEIO,
she shouted. Only then did she realize her precarious position. She ran back behind the steel monstrosity, shrieking with every bang and clang, as if she was only now aware of the danger.
By Mithras. What were you thinking?
Asked Brina, shocked to see KLEIO laughing.
I know how to control this thing now.
Which did little to convince Brina of her sanity before she pressed two switches on the inside leg, and the cursed machine popped open. She threw herself inside, hearing the sound of rifle fire hitting the armor. Inside, KLEIO sat face to face with an almost alien apparatus, safely outside her Earth. Chromium-plated tubes were suspended over struts, connected to wire and plates, knobs, switches, controllers, gauges, levers, and control sticks in a mechanical jumble. This was how an early 20th century person pictured the cockpit of a spaceship. She had to think briefly about how the devil's work could be powered up. It was strange to recall memories of a stranger, until the process came to her mind, and she successively pulled the right lever, switch, and button to make the infernal machine wake up. What happened subsequently became incomprehensible for her three companions, even more so for their enemies. With a hiss of a steam engine, the hum of its power source, the Armabellum 415 became active. The ground shook, and cracks stretched across the earth toward their enemies, including her allies in cover. Inside the Armabellum, KLEIO felt only a slight tremor. From her visor, she could see everything in front of her disintegrate into its constituent parts. She glanced at the display, and the frequency was set far too high. Shima escaped her unwanted destruction with a dive roll. KLEIO's coordination didn't quite align with the memory. The spy remained unscathed, and was already turning her attention to the next attackers. KLEIO stabilized the machine a bit. On the side opposite, she made a beeline for an entire squadron of Laxarians, sonicating them with waves from the mighty cylinders. Those who remained were cut down by the salvos of the others. More Laxarians poured in from the surrounding area to the backyard, and KLEIO cranked up the frequency. Higher, higher, and higher she turned the slider until the concussion pressed the marrow into their gums, briefly at maximum force, which shattered a wall in the building on the other side. KLEIO feared everything would collapse, the world would crumble. It was not yet clear to her what remained standing. Her enemies dissolved into swaths of devastation. What had been there before was pulverized. Behind them, Brina sought shelter. Clearly, KLEIO lacked the practice she possessed in her head. Every movement came haltingly over the iron joints. Brina had to dodge the leg as KLEIO made a turn. Mind you, to the other side. Otherwise, she would have crossed over into the swath. After the last Laxarian with a death wish got his way, and the rest began to retreat, only then did KLEIO's panic set in. Fortunately, the feeling was delayed. When she realized that quite a few soldiers had just fallen by her hand, her stomach turned. It had been so easy for her, as if the officer was guiding her hand. His memories blunted her emotions. She opened the airlock as the fear of suffocation overtook, and vomited onto the battlefield. Suddenly, there was an eerie silence.
Oh, honey.
Shima spoke with compassion and pride.
Your first time? Then such a bloodbath right away. Not bad. I'm feeling better already,
replied KLEIO, hardly sounding like it.
They would have done the same to us, wouldn't they?
Possibly all that was needed was to get the officer's memories out of her system. Brina and Emery took the moment for a situation briefing. He was conferring over the radio with the resistance fighters. They waited for the right time for him to give the order to advance all available units to the Denti estate. Too soon, and the soldiers here would have been on guard. Too late, and they would get the full charge of the Laxarian force. He had communicated the attack during their maneuver. Now, the rebels were advancing from the western and southern roads, which gave them the necessary leeway. The rebels positioned themselves on the flanks, and took the residents as a diversion under fire.
How many more do you think are entrenched in there?
Asked Emery Brina.
Too many.
She replied.
We don't have time to smoke them out. Besides, I'm sure they've barricaded the door. Fortunately, we have a solution ready.
She looked at KLEIO, who already understood without having to read minds. She boarded the iron beast and maneuvered it to the front of the bunker, broke open the gate with the waves first, and paralyzed the remaining soldiers with a mild frequency. Directly, Shima, Brina, and Emery fell in like a death squad, and cleaned out the corridor as well as the chamber at the rear end. Shots rang out, only by their own weapons. Unable to move, The Laxarians were at their mercy, the last defenders between them and the success of the mission found the mercy of death. KLEIO remained on the outside. The consideration of whether she should remain on the lookout inside the armabellum seemed reasonable before the officer's recollection came like an afterthought. The Laxarians installed encrypted transmitters in their constructs. With those, they could detonate the machines. Thus, none of their technologies had yet fallen into enemy hands. Those who knew their secret codes were so fanatical that they chose suicide over betraying their faith. Additionally, those in the know never held high ranks. She therefore joined the technical division inside, left with a queasy feeling, and did so quickly. While entering the transmitting station, she heard the explosion. The monstrosity would have become an Iron Maiden for her. It was now foreseeable that the Laxarians would assail, and it was now amounting to a suicide mission. KLEIO tried to come to terms with the idea of dying a heroine, and wondered whether she would wake up somewhere else after, here a week ago, or not at all. Any event that happened away from her left a gap in her storyline. She had chosen a side of this story without knowing the exact background or where she was heading. Ultimately, what this episode boiled down to was a MacGuffin. In a world without Alfred Hitchcock and with a Geoff 4, it probably became something like a MacJoven. More postmodernly fate could hardly be acknowledged. The faithful of Ispat had desecrated the walls, defaced the symbols of the Mithraic faith. KLEIO had the necessary empathy, saw how disgusted Brina was with the occupiers. She had experienced the extent of their cruelty firsthand. However, never like the woman who had to witness the destruction of her culture. Out of disgust grew the determination to lead the resistance to victory. Now it was within reach. Metaphorical reach became actual when she saw the transmitting station in the secret rooms of the Denty estate. Dark furniture was covered with strange equipment, the latter connected by copper and silver wires.
We'll have company soon,
said KLEIO as calmly as possible. For this assessment, it needed no recollection from a Laxarian officer. Here, she lacked the necessary expertise. She tried, therefore, not to get in the way of the others.
Is there anything I can do to help you?
She asked, interrupting with it rather.
I need silence more than anything else, and probably more time than we have,
replied Brina indignantly, as she inspected the equipment. She took in the layout, found what she was after in the tangle of apparatuses, and beckoned Emery closer.
Give me the transmitter.
He pulled a device from his shoulder bag and handed it to her. She bent down under the machine and began tinkering with the wires, connecting her device to the Laxarian. KLEIO actually wanted to remain silent, chose to interrupt again.
Why don't you just destroy the device?
We have to infiltrate our frequency first, before we disable theirs,
Emery explained.
That way, our creature spreads like a disease instead of the Laxarians reactivating theirs in another location.
It would have been a lie on KLEIO's part to claim that she understood, and yet she nodded, not wanting to interrupt further. Emery latched onto the radio again and inquired,
Mithra 1 here. Cautes and Cautopartes. Do you copy? What is the current situation?
Grating, the radio tuned in at the other end. He could barely be understood over the brute noise around him.
We're under fire. Several armabellum units have been spotted a few blocks away. We can't hold the position much longer.
Nothing came from the second squad. From the outside, rifle shots rang out. First a few, then more and more, until it sounded like the fulminant climax of fireworks at the New Year's celebration. And so suddenly the noise died down again. Silence came over the crescendo. Only the sounds of Brina's tinkering could be heard. Her own gulping reflex echoed in KLEIO's ears before she hesitantly asked,
What do you think is going on?
Our people certainly didn't stop shooting because they were winning,
Emery replied. He pulled out his pistol and took a few steps toward the entrance, before he checked the radio once more without success. Emery and Shima grabbed their weapons, ran back and secured the corridor for as long as they could. Brina needed time they didn't have, and they were willing to pay with their lives for the seconds she needed. All at once, shots were fired nearby. 3, 6, 9, and increasing, until KLEIO could no longer count. Vigorously, they defended the inner area. Every shot of Shimar's a hit, and at least every third of Emery's. Their ammunition wouldn't last much longer. The sheer number of invading hordes soon became overwhelming. She was startled when the firing ceased. Their time was up. Startled again when all of a sudden someone entered the broadcast room. Emery. And he was alone. The concern for Shimar immediately vanished when he revealed,
The lesbian took off after I received no response over the radio.
He was out of breath and collected himself.
Mithra 1 here. Request status.
Emery inquired. Radio silence. It was telling enough.
How much longer do you need, Brina?
Longer if I'm rushed and have to explain myself?
Came the biting reply. Once again, Emery tried to contact their allies, again getting no response. The sounds from outside had all fallen silent. Their fighters were overwhelmed by the Collegat's units.
Brina.
So,
She returned annoyed, having just finished, and she rose.
we can disable their frequency.
Before, victory had been within reach. Now, a finger snap away. This moment decided the war. They were on the verge of turning the tide of a conflict that had claimed more lives in this world than any other. If Emery or she had just stood a bit closer to the switch, or had KLEIO known which one to press, things would have turned out differently. Suddenly, they were paralyzed by an invisible force, the old familiar and most terrible sensation. The paralyzing sound waves of the Armabella 415. The Laxarians had averted their advance and thwarted the coup in its final stages.
No!
Gasped Brina. It was a wonder she could get a word out at all. Right before their target, frozen into a swoon.
If it isn't my muse.
A familiar voice suddenly spoke self-righteously. The same officer who had picked up KLEIO and the Taudians and had them shipped off to the prison camp. Cruxborough 04121008. Certainly the complete number had slipped her mind, but she would never forget his face. A face that was engraved with the atrocities committed by its owner. He had beaten her harder than anyone had ever beaten her before, and that was probably one of the less shameful deeds of his career, which did, however, get her translation software installed. It hardly made him a do-gooder. At the Ispatian masses, she had sometimes prayed she would never have to see him again. Unlike him, his prayers had been answered.
I hope that our next meeting would be under more pleasant circumstances,
he said impulsively, while he came very close to her and ran his hand through her hair. She felt his breath as he smelled her neck. Once again, they must have turned off the frequency right away. They knew how long the after effect of the weapon lasted. By the time the paralysis subsided, they had already been handcuffed. The switch moved out of reach as they were led away.
Where is Shima?
KLEIO wondered. She had vanished like the wind. Stay tuned for weekly chapters. Like, share, and subscribe for more wacky adventures. We thank you for your support.